So I'll just do a quick introduction. Welcome to the Lausanne Collegiate School SEL Social Emotional Learning Program and Lausanne Learning Virtual SEL Book Club. This week or this month, it's December, we are reading Lost Connections, Why You're Depressed and How to Find Hope by Johann Hari. Greg Graber is here with us. He recommended this book for the book club. We've also got Amy Brownlee, who is the lower school ANTS teacher and the Lausanne Learning Assistant Director here with us. So I'll just kick it off and say I enjoyed this book and I understand why it's controversial. What did y'all think?
No, I agree with you. I thoroughly enjoyed it. I felt like at parts it was a little bit dense. It was a lot to absorb. It was one of those books where it's definitely not a quick read and you just pick it up and it's got some heavy stuff. I really like that it made me contemplate sort of the whole notion of what mental illness is, what's anxiety, what's depression, and he kind of shed different light on ways to look at it, from a sociological perspective. I thought that was really interesting.
Yeah, it was a definite hard read, especially the first part of it. It was really hard to get into. But I think towards the end and kind of exploring the different avenues, it was kind of eye opening, but it was a very difficult read for me, at least.
Yeah, I loved it though. It's rare, Amy. I agree with you. It's not rare that I agree with you. I was going to say it's rare that I will read a book and want to reread it, but I could see myself reading this again, and that's rare because I, like you guys, I always have like 4 or 5 different books on my nightstand and another 10 on a list that I want to read. But there was so much in this book, um, and Amber, I agree, very controversial figure, Mr. Hari is. Um, the thing that really struck me the most was his contention that not to paint with too broad of a stroke, that cause often for mental illness, anxiety, depression is sort of lack of social connections and lack of social network instead of it being sort of a biological brain chemistry type deficit, for lack of a better way to say it. I found that very interesting. I would imagine that big pharma and sort of psychologists and psychiatrists of the world probably aren't too happy with his take on that.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, for me, that was, as I was reading it, was kind of controversial, like just to think about because there is an actual biological problem sometimes, like, and
Mhm.
I think that he does a really good job of saying, I'm not telling you not to take antidepressants.
Mhm.
He doesn't say, like we always see those memes, right, of like, go walk in the woods and you won't be depressed. Like, I don't feel like that's what he's saying. I i really feel like a lot of the controversy surrounding this book is he's actually saying, if you need those things, that's okay. But here are some things that can cause depression. Here are some things that can cause anxiety. And if you're at a level where you can function to work within those things, here's some ways you can do that. I mean, the nine major areas of disconnection. I mean, I think we can all identify with all of those, whether we have depression, anxiety, or not.
Especially
And
now.
for me, yeah,
Mhm.
especially now, and for me, that was one of the pieces where I'm like, yes, on the surface, this is kind of a controversial take. And I agree with you. I think like big pharma, I think psychiatrists in particular probably don't love what he's saying. But I think that his deeper point is when we are functioning on our like normal level, these are the things that can cause depression and anxiety and disconnectedness from people. I absolutely agree.
No, I think they're starting to see some of his sentiments in other places. I'm looking at the list that you furnished us, and number 6 is the natural world. So, for instance, in Japan, physicians now are writing prescriptions for what's called nature bathing. So basically, encouraging individuals who are suffering from depression or anxiety to go out into the natural world and nature and sort of immerse sort of their senses in the forest. And there are sort of medicinal benefits to that. It lowers blood pressure, lowers heart rate. It's sort of a natural tranquilizer. So things like that that we know that are good for us. Um, when you read this book, it's like, okay, that makes sense. Like today, I had sort of an anxious day at work. I know that's hard for you guys to imagine because you work with me. So then I come home and I'm playing with one of my dogs. Well, there's science behind that. That releases oxytocin into our brain. It's sort of the love or the feel good hormone. So a lot of what he said from a common sense perspective really made sense.
Yeah, and I think too, like when he talks about, I mean, I found the meaningful work chapter to be important too, and I think
Mhm.
very relevant right now that we all know that when we do work that is meaningful to us, whatever that means, whatever is meaningful, we know we feel better. But tying that to the actual like state of depression or state of anxiety, I hadn't really thought about that. We've all had jobs we don't like or that we didn't find meaningful, but I think it goes back to the idea of depression and anxiety being collective problems rather than individual problems. That idea of meaningful work, I feel like in our society that's also like a societal problem, like what work is. Um because even if we find our work meaningful, it's very much encouraged in our society to just kind of work and say yes, and productivity is king. And I think as well as saying we're disconnected, I think he's also saying maybe we're focusing on the wrong things at work or when we're looking at what we see in other people, to talk about the second one.
I agree with that 100% because, I've had jobs that I didn't like. However, if you're valued at those jobs, if your opinion matters and if you're cared for at those jobs, it's more meaningful. So it's the way in which you're treated at your job that could make it more meaningful for you, even if it's like selling perfume or working retail, which is terrible in my opinion. It's one of those things where if you're valued at your job, if you feel like you're putting forth your best effort and it's being recognized, it can alleviate some of that depression and anxiety as well.
I agree 100%, Amy. I think we kind of live in this culture of achievement right now, and there's a certain glorification of busyness and achievement that we all sort of wear on our sleeves like a badge of honor. And I think he made mention of Viktor Frankl, or is that my imagination? Do you guys remember? I read this a while back because he talked about sort of meaningfulness in his logotherapy philosophy.
Yeah, and I know that there are several articles that connect the two
Yeah.
as well that I've read, because it is this idea of, what is meaningful. And it's kind of like, I know Amy, I know you and I have talked about this, but so they're like Venn diagrams, right, with the two things. But then there's also the thing that's like your like sweet spot for work is something that makes you happy, something that provides like meaning, and something that pays you. And you can have a hobby which makes you happy and provides meaning, but that's not the same thing. And so it's kind of, when I read the meaningful work chapter, that's what I really thought about, was that idea of like what is in that center, what does all of these things without, and for me this is important, without glorifying busyness. I agree, without busyness being a
Or
mark of productivity.
yeah, or achievement. Like, you know, we do it with our children as educators. We see parents do it, and I think sometimes we're guilty of doing it as well. A lot of times it becomes all about that grade or that test score a little bit.
Or society's view of the profession as well. Because you think
Yeah.
about, all the essential workers and how um, during this pandemic they've been glorified, but they've always done that work.
Mhm.
So why is it now that they're being appreciated? They should have been appreciated from the very beginning. And I think society really looks down on those essential workers that we deem so valuable now, that the society's view on what's meaningful um, may take away from your idea of what's meaningful as well.
It's a great way to articulate it. Part of it for me, as someone who teaches mindfulness too, is it goes back to gratitude. I think you cultivate more gratitude if you're, instead of trying to seek happiness, you're seeking meaningfulness, but especially by helping other people, and sort of your contribution to the world. Um, we've all known a lot of people that have really good jobs that make a lot of money, but they're not happy. And I think it's often because they do not sort of derive that sense of meaningfulness from their work or their vocation.
Yeah, so the part of the book that really, I agree, like, the beginning, I was like, "Yeah, cool. I see where we're going," but, this is pretty dense, right? But when he gets into these points about disconnection, about what causes disconnection, how we can identify those, for me too, the childhood trauma part was really interesting because I think that as educators, we probably see that a lot more, like, quantity wise, but we also see children struggling in ways that maybe their parents don't see. And then the second layer of that is that many educators have our own childhood traumas.
That's a great point.
So we're out there just kind of living in these worlds that we've kind of created for ourselves, and that trauma that we're trying to protect ourselves from, that trauma, and that can be really difficult for educators, both as, I think, because you can swing both ways, right? You either protect yourself so much that you don't let anyone in, or you have such empathy for kids that you let them in too much. And I thought that was an interesting, very relevant to educators kind of chapter.
So the term that I've heard for what the phenomenon you were just talking about is compassion fatigue, and it comes with healthcare workers, teachers, anyone who sort of serves other people. And you're so right about the trauma as well. I think Eckhart Tolle calls it sort of our pain bodies. We're conditioned in early childhood, sort of from our parents' behaviors and our socialization in our family unit. And so many of these traumas that we've absorbed are on sort of a non conscious level. Therefore, we sort of react to things instead of respond. And as educators, both of you are right. We don't know what traumas children are bringing sort of to the tables when they show up in our classrooms, and we're unconscious again of our traumas. So it's sort of it's interesting. It's scary how that works too.
Yeah, it reminds me of, in a very different setting, so in my academic work as a historian, we always talk about, like, historians don't just show up and tell you the story. Like, that's not our job. We show up with our box of tools, and there are very specific tools, and we tell you the story that we build out of the tools that we have. But I think our students do that, and I think we do that as well. We show up with our toolbox, and our toolbox has good stuff, but it also has, like, trauma and
Mhm.
grief and, you know, mismanaged expectations, and we build what we can build out of those tools. And I think sometimes we expect educators to find their work so meaningful that all of these other sources of disconnection don't matter.
No, that's a great point. Another concept that he brought up that I found particularly interesting is that of junk values. How our society worships junk values, things that really essentially aren't important and they don't necessarily facilitate our growth as human beings. And you think about it, I went on my social media sabbatical. I think it was back in September for about a month after watching Social Dilemma, and it kind of tied into that too. But I worry about children on social media and Instagram and the messages that they get from that. And again, our collective consciousness sort of worships these junk values. Like, how many likes did I get? Or, what is that movie star wearing on Instagram? Or things like that that really aren't essential to our growth.
I totally agree because you talk to any lower school kid and they want to be a YouTuber or a TikTok star.
Oh, that is so, that is sad. But remember, you guys are younger than me, but it all started with like Paris Hilton, I believe. I can't believe I remember this because I promise I wasn't into Paris Hilton, but they asked her, "What do you want to be?" And I think her answer was famous. Yeah, and sadly that's a job now. That's a career. These social media influencers. I have nothing against them, but it's sort of they perpetuate that sense of junk values that he talked about.
And it's so
And
accessible now. Like, I
yeah,
mean, there are kids in kindergarten who are, have millions of followers on Instagram and YouTube and have their own shows on Netflix,
yeah,
and have their own balloons in the Macy's Thanksgiving Day Parade. And we're shifting from the culture of it took movie stars. It was hard to become famous. Now it's all you have to do is have one viral video and you're famous. So
yeah. Unlike the good ones, like the kid president actually has some values and some,
yeah,
But
but
yeah,
it's like,
yeah,
let's see how many different foods we can mix together and how gross it's going to be, and you can watch it on YouTube or watch this person play a video game that you could play yourself.
yeah.
So it's about glorifying those people, which I don't really understand. So
And it's
okay.
kind of rude or insulting behavior. They'll video that, and it's like, when we worked in the middle school together, Amy, we used to deal with that all the time. So, yeah, the junk values are. I think he equated it to how junk food is for the body, junk values is for the soul and the mind. So, I thought that was really something interesting.
And I
Yeah,
think
and
that
I
comes
think,
down. Go ahead.
well, I was just gonna say, one, the most wholesome thing on the internet though is the Twitter account I Pet That Dog. Because it's this kid who like his parents run it, but he like pets dogs and like introduces you to them and he's like, this is Tuna, she blah blah, right? But also I think that with the that kind of influencer culture, it also really discounts people who do work really hard. And Greg, I know you and I talked about this, but it's also gendered. When
Oh yeah,
women are social media famous, they're influencers. When men are social media famous, they're entrepreneurs
or thought
and
leaders, right? Or
or thought leaders or coaches.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah, and I think that's worrying to me on another level because then, it's not just I got told when I was 12 that I was bad at math because girls are bad at math. Now it's I'm 5 and I see a woman working really hard, but she's just an influencer. I think
yeah,
that there's also that gendered aspect that is harmful to kids too, beyond all the other stuff and the rampant consumerism and, which I think we're all guilty of in some ways. But I think everyone here is old enough to recognize, like, yeah, I bought this thing because I saw it on Instagram. Like, kids don't have that cognitive process in the same way.
Right. And
no, I
so,
agree. Go ahead, Amy.
how might educators change that in young kids today? How might we bring that into the classroom and use it as a teachable moment? And
That's a great question.
I think it really starts with the combination of social emotional learning and digital citizenship. And I think that starts at as early as pre-kindergarten, having these conversations, because kids as young as 3 years old, 2 years old, are consumers of media. Um, my daughter knew how to work an iPad at a very young age, and can run circles around some adults. And those adults are the ones that are teaching her in the classroom. So we've got to bridge that gap somehow. And I think it really comes into combining that social emotional aspect and digital citizenship and having those conversations.
I'm not
It's pretty
surprised if it's your daughter. I'm not surprised because she takes after her mom. She's a tech wizard, so that's not really a fair. Um, but I agree, Amy. And we were talking about this a little bit before we went on air. Um, Combining SEL and digital citizenship, it makes such sense because if we look back sort of at the junk values phenomena, we're all probably somewhat less happy, as a result of the technology that we deal with on social media. Some of us use it a lot where it becomes almost an emotional pacifier. Instead of dealing with our thoughts and emotions, it's easy to scroll. And then I'm going to throw Amber under the bus. Amber likes to hate scroll. I didn't know. I'm an old man. I didn't know what that meant. So she'll find, right? We know. I'm not going to name who he is. He's a thought leader,
Oh,
but so there's that too. But if you think about it, and it started years ago, probably in the early 2000s. I think our society has taken on the tone of we have this message board. Not that message boards are a thing anymore, but a message board mentality. When our political leaders, and I'm not playing politics, on both ends of the political spectrum, um, can be so divisive and so there's such a lack of civility, and kids pick up on that, and that has to lead to our anxiousness and our depression and our anxiety. And the other thing is, the whole guise of social media, well, it's supposed to make us more connected to one another. Actually, all the studies show that the more time we feel on that, the more time that we spend on social media, the more time we feel alienated and alone and depressed and anxious. So that's a big part of it. And that's not an anti tech thing at all. It kind of goes to Amy's point about digital citizenship. It all starts with education. We need to spend more time as educators teaching our students and ourselves not only how to use the technology and sort of the perils of overuse of technology, but the effect that it has on us, and sort of how to be literate with our emotions in regards to the technology as well.
and right now adults are not being very good models.
Not at all.
Not at
Not at
all.
all.
So it's really up to us as educators to feed the positive and gratitude narrative in that aspect. And as much as I'm a person of that's very tech savvy, I was never taught digital citizenship in school. I ended up taking a class on it over the summer, but, as educators, I think it's not because we don't wanna have those conversations, it's because we don't know how. And I
Yeah,
think we need to have those conversations, but we need to have the opportunity to talk with each other first and have that development, the professional development on how to have these conversations and how to do it in a most positive way.
I agree. And I don't even think it's necessarily just from an emotional perspective that we teach what it does, but we should teach kids what it does to our brains, too much time on our phones, all that kind of stuff, what it does to our attention spans. You know, so good point.
yeah. And I think that that kind of goes back to something we talked about in a conference last month, in the Diversity and Equity in Schools conference, where Noma brought up the point that like talking about race is hard, but because it's hard, we should do it. Because
Yeah,
it's important, we should do it. And I think that goes for digital citizenship as well. You just have to get on Facebook and look at any news site. I am very guilty of reading the newspaper from my hometown's Facebook page, which is not a good idea. But, you just get on there and see what people say. And some of it is the anonymity of the internet. Like, some of those people would say things to your face, but like most people would not say that if they were connected to a person, like physically or personally connected to someone. But there's just that it's like you said, like message boards, right? It's like a message board with no filter. And I think when we create on those message boards, whether it's Instagram or Twitter or Facebook or whatever, some of the things that are created are beautiful and wonderful, but the consumption of it is so rampant compared to the creation that it does, I mean, it disconnects us from people because they're not real people anymore. They're
That's a
an
great. That's a
influencer.
great. That's a wonderful point. So, Yuri Havel, Harari, the Israeli historian who wrote *Sapiens*, and what was the
Mhm.
other one I read? You guys know who I'm talking about, right?
Yeah.
He had a great quote. I'm going to butcher it, but it was something to the effect: in the olden days, like say the 1950s, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, pre-internet, censorship was the withholding of information. Now it's the pumping out disinformation, like large quantities of disinformation is what censorship is now. So I think the technology has evolved in such a way and become such a part of our lives that our emotions and our minds can't really keep up with it. So we really have to have a conscious effort. Like when we're going outside or going to exercise, just put the phone down for a little bit and give yourself a, not only are you working out sort of physically, but sort of cognitively as well. You're giving your brain a rest. To have a more mindful approach, when we're online with social media and our devices is, I think, a really helpful thing that we can do. It's easier to say than do. I mean, I lecture on this stuff all the time, and you just get sucked into it. I mean, it's that dopamine effect.
But it's also about teaching super citizenship. Is like you teach kids how to act in person and how to have those relationships and communicate in person. It should extend to the digital world as well. So if we're grounded in the SEL aspect, especially in the classroom, that should extend to the digital world as well. And I think young people are much more positive, especially at a younger age, than adults. Especially, I think about people my age who didn't grow up with social media, so now that they feel that disconnection. But I don't think that kids, especially the kids that are in K through 12 now, have that disconnection as much. Um, Maybe the older grades, but the younger grades, I do think that when they are online, they are themselves and they just model what they see in the world. So as adults, we have to model the positive behaviors in addition to teaching the proper ways to be
That's
a
a great
citizen.
that's a great point because it's the old nomenclature. They're digital natives and we're digital immigrants, and they're somehow navigating this accelerated culture in the cyber world better than us because I think they've been educated by good people like you, and they've been around the technology for their whole lives. It's nothing new to them. Basically, they come out, they're born, and they're basking in the blue glow of the iPad. That's their first babysitter now, for better or for worse. But I think it's one of those things. It's anything in moderation is okay. Well, I don't want to say anything, but any of these types of things in moderation, I think is okay. It's just being self-aware is really important. Teaching them self-awareness in addition to digital citizenship is helps.
Yeah, and I thought that that's one place too where this book kind of, for me, I think it would have been very easy for him to say, "Here are all the ways we're disconnected,"
Hmm.
and that would be the end. But instead, he goes and talks about reconnection. And I think that's where a lot of the conversations stop, because it's a hard conversation. I think that I hear a lot of people say, "Oh, these kids, these millennials," and I'm like, "We're almost 40. Like, hold on now." But like, these kids, they're always on their phones. Okay, there's the complaint. What's the solution? And I
Yeah,
thought that that was an interesting thing he did, talking about the reconnection to meaningful work, the reconnection to nature, the reconnection to a safe space for childhood trauma. This isn't a self-help book by any means, but I thought that that was a very useful thing to say. Like, I he even makes the point in the reconnection to meaningful work. He says that, he gets optimistic and then he gets sad about it again because he sees that a lot of people don't have meaningful work and it's a societal problem, but he's still kind of offering some solutions. And I think our students look to us to not only say, you kids are on your phones too much, they also look to us to say, here's how to be responsible citizens. Here's how digital citizenship works, but also that generational judging has to be removed from the equation, I almost feel like. And I felt like he did I don't know exactly how old he is, but I think he did a good job of that, of saying, these are the problems. Now, here are some ways we can reconnect. I think our
No,
students need that too.
that's a good point. I'm a Generation Xer. I think Amy is too, even though I'm a little bit older than Amy. So I blame the millennials and the boomers. So it's like, okay, boomer, and it's like, oh, those millennials, get off my lawn, right? So no,
Well,
you're
I
exactly right.
wonder, I really wonder how this pandemic is going to affect that reconnection once it's over.
Hmm.
Is it going to be better? Because I know that especially during the lockdowns, people got outside more. There were things on Facebook where my kids and I would go on a walk in the neighborhood and count the bears in the windows. It was a bear hunt. So I think people are getting to nature more now
Hmm.
because it's safe. But I wonder how the reconnection is going to happen and what it's going to look like after this pandemic is over. Is it going to be better? Is it going to be worse? Are we going to be like so used to being secluded in our own worlds that we don't venture out to reconnect? Or are we going to like run out and just hug everybody we can? Like, hey, you stranger, I miss hugs. Give me a hug. I wonder what that's going to look like.
No, that's a good thought. Good questions. I've heard it phrased before that this is almost like, in some regards, a big reset. A big reset button has been clicked. One for the environment, everything that we've done to the environment, but also um, a lot of the social stuff in society as well. Not by any means that this has been a good thing at all, but if there can be any positive that comes as a result from this traumatic pandemic, maybe it's that it's kind
I
of a big
also think
slowdown.
it's brought awareness to a lot of different things as well, where people maybe have more time to realize the issues that the world is facing these days, not only the environment but also social justice issues. And people have more time to kind of reflect on themselves. Um, so I think that's a positive in that aspect. But I also wonder, like, you know, is it gonna just reset and go back to the way it was before? That's my worry. Is I know this has been a hard year. It's been crazy, but I think that there has to be some sort of silver lining behind all of this. That we've learned either something about ourselves or something about the way in which we are living that needs to change. And are we going to take those steps to make it better?
Yep.
Well, as a millennial, I spent the entire time baking sourdough and collecting houseplants, but, that's just me. No, I think you're right. I think one of the big dangers, maybe not in society as a whole, but especially in education, is when are we going to get back to normal? And I'm like, y'all need to hold on because normal was not very good. Like, we're all in a very good situation. And I think we genuinely have great connections with students. And we are in a culture that, thanks to both of you in a lot of ways, that creates that culture of, digital citizenship and SEL and mindfulness and all of the things that we value. But education as a whole is very has been very test driven and very grades driven, and those junk values in that are in education, I mean, I see those as things that are not actually important to learning. I don't want to go back to that. Like, I don't
Yeah.
want to go back to normal. I want to be able to see people in person and, like, high five a student. And I really want to meet with my history day kids in person because, like, they never respond to my emails. But, like, I don't want to go back to teaching to the test and bell schedules that are insane for high school students. Like, that's a normal that we do need to reset. And I worry, that in the search for reconnection, that we're just going to go back to what we've always done. I think we have a really big opportunity to not do that and to make reconnections rather than like rewinding. And for anyone younger than a millennial, rewinding as you put it in the machine and it rewinds your videotape. So
It's interesting how, they say it's kind of funny that Generation X, us latchkey kids, have really thrived during this, like being alone at home and stuff, right? One just small note on a piece of what you were talking about, Amber, is as a species, we're wired for face-to-face interaction and hugs and high fives and handshakes. I hope all of that does not become a thing of the past.
yeah, I hope that those values are what we reconnect with. But we say, look at all these things that we didn't do. So, one example is a lot of states have done away with standardized testing for the year. And standardized testing, you could argue, has some values, but I think that as educators, we're all like, this is terrible. Like, I want to reconnect with students. Like, I want to high five a student. I want to have in person classes, but I don't want to teach to a test, right? I mean, there are certain tests, like I think the AP and the IB and those things, but like the map testing for sixth graders, like that's that's not a thing that I think we're missing. I think we miss seeing our students, but we don't miss a lot of the bureaucracy that we're seeing maybe isn't necessary. And maybe even disconnects us even more from meaningful work. How many educators do all of us know personally who would be more apt to stay in the education field if it was those things that are actually important? If it was, connecting with students and teaching students and it wasn't the bureaucracy. Um, maybe those are the important things.
We're starting to see very slowly fewer colleges and universities putting emphasis on the big test scores. I think we've got a long way to go with that. A lot of them are starting sort of the portfolio application process. I think and I hope maybe that's a wave of the future.
So, and just to go back to what you were saying about reconnecting and this pandemic, especially for the younger students, for me, when we were full virtual, I was able to connect with more students on a personal level than in the classroom, just because I saw them in their comfort zone. They were home, they were in their element, they had their things around them, they were comfortable. They weren't, worried about the kid that was sitting next to them and what they thought or what they did. They were at home, and they opened up a little bit more. So I think that's the part that we need to bring back into the classrooms, is that space that they feel like they're home.
Yeah, I agree with you. We were talking earlier too. I present a lot, and I've been doing a lot on Zoom. I miss going in person, but there's a lot of value though that you can get through these tech platforms as well, as far as accessibility and availability, and like you said, people being more comfortable in their own homes or their own elements, without a doubt. Hopefully, it'll be sort of a hybrid mix of the best of both worlds, in person and virtual.
Yeah, I do
Yeah.
miss collaborating and being like having working in groups, very closely, and high fives and hugs. I miss high fives and hugs.
I was a kid growing up. I was sort of a jock, really into sports, and I see now with a lot of teams not able to practice and compete right now, and I hate it.
Well, and I think in some ways too, like I brought this point up to someone the other day that school, in a lot of ways, like going to school, isn't what life is actually like, you know? I've never had a job in my adult life where I couldn't get up and like walk across the room if I wanted to. I've never had to sit at a desk, like kind of pinned down all day. I've never transitioned to other desks. Like that would be weird and uncomfortable for everyone. Like I think that we're also seeing through students being in their comfort zone that a lot of students are saying, wow, like being comfortable while I'm at work is really important. And like my hope for that is that those students grow up to demand more of the society in which they live. Hari brings up that he says that loneliness is a product of the way we live. And I wonder if this experience of kind of forced loneliness, but also finding where you fit and finding your comfort zone without the stressors that we've added to school, physical school, I wonder if that is going to make this generation and these future generations demand more of the society that they live in. That may be very hopeful, but that's what I would
Yeah,
like to think is going to happen.
it's almost like we've talked about before, the concept of personalized learning. And I know Simon, who is one of your mentors, Amber, for Laws and Learning, talks quite a bit about personalized learning. Because as we were talking about earlier, we all bring our experiences, our conditioning, and our traumas to school with us as kids and adults. Um, I was one of those kids that I liked college so much better than I saw high school as a waste of time, and grade school, to be honest. I hated the conformity and the restrictions that you were talking about, having to ask to go to the restroom and have your hand up, and it's all about having the right answer. It's not about having the right question. I think we kind of have to get those aligned.
Yeah, especially if we're saying that we're losing these connections. How do we not just make these connections for ourselves, but how do we ensure that our students don't have lost connections?
Mhm,
And that if that does happen, that they are able to reconnect. I
mhm.
mean, I think that that's, you know, again, I mean, I'm not a psychologist or anyone who would ever tell someone not to seek medical help for mental illness, but I do think, what if kids just didn't ever get disconnected in the first place?
Wow, yeah, that'd be wonderful. And adults, for that matter,
Right.
Yeah.
right?
But you also have to think like how technology holds kids together right now anyway. So my teenage son connects with his friends through this whole pandemic. He's talked to them every single day through technology, which that's normal for him. So he's not really disconnected from them other than he can't see them in person, and I think he would prefer talking to them online anyway. So it's especially because he's middle school, so he's socially awkward anyway. That having that might not have as a negative impact on him in this situation as it will my daughter who's much younger. So I wonder how that's going to play out for those adolescents who thrive in that online environment, connect, connecting with their friends in that online environment versus younger students or even older students who crave that face to face.
So it's interesting. I'm in my mid 50s, and I wouldn't say I'm socially awkward, but I'm an introvert. But I would much rather text my friends than call them on the phone. And that sounds so shallow, but I don't think it is shallow. Maybe it sounds it, but it's, yeah, it keeps me connected to my friends.
Yeah, it's kind of like the vehicle isn't what matters.
Yeah,
Like whether it's technology or it's in person or texting versus calling, which like please no one ever call me. Like I don't even want my husband to call me. Like just text me. Um but
yeah.
like to me too, the idea of like digital citizenship, for example, it's not telling them what to do. It's like you have to learn how to drive. Like, so technology may be the vehicle, but the people driving it, that's where the focus needs to be. And I think that with generations or with groups or with people who think technology is just bad, screen time is bad, they're not focusing on the driver, they're just focusing on the vehicle. And you don't train a car to drive like you train a person to drive. It doesn't matter what they drive, you still train them. And so I think that's a big piece too, is removing that kind of stigma from like screen time. From it's about the values, it's about what you get and what you give, not what you're using.
Yeah, it's about taking breaks during screen time. It's like writing with a pencil for too long is going to give you a blister. That's just to your point. That's just an instrument of learning, just like a device is. You know.
Right. And you can do positive things with it or you can do negative things with it. If you're constantly a consumer, then yeah, you probably need more breaks than someone who's creating and then creating in a positive way. So, and I think that really comes down to the way technology is used in the classrooms now is, are we training our kids to be consumers, or are we training our kids to be creators and creating an environment in which they want to live in the future?
Yeah, I love that quote. I was going to say that the create. You know, we're meant to be creators, not consumers. I agree with you. It's a wonderful point.
Yeah, I think that, I see why this book is controversial, and I also understand why he gets some flack for a couple things, especially like, you know, talking so much about I think he doesn't take his privilege into account in some
Mhm.
ways. I can definitely see that. But I also think, he brings up a really good points. Not even as much about losing connections, but about how to reconnect. I think that this was a really interesting choice to read in what month are we in of the pandemic? Month
So
9?
remember when I proposed it, though, I said going in the holidays between Thanksgiving and Christmas. I think it's a good time because a lot of people get kind of down, you know,
Mhm.
during the holidays. It's darker, it's colder. Um, you know, we aren't getting real Thanksgivings with our extended families and or Christmas, and I think it was a good. It wasn't definitely a happy holiday book, but I think our timing was pretty good.
Yeah, especially there's so much divisiveness right now, but to your point, I mean, I made a turkey, but I was supposed to be having Thanksgiving dinner with like my sister and her family and my, people that I love and want to see. And instead, it was still great, but, you know, it wasn't the same. And Christmas isn't going to be the same. And the holidays in general aren't this time of year that we build up in a lot of ways in our minds as a time of joy and of Thanksgiving and of, connection. How do we maintain those? Like, my mom showing me how to make latkes over Zoom is not gonna be the same as her in my kitchen making them with me. Now is a really good time to evaluate those connections, and coming up on a break for educators, I mean, a break, like, we're all gonna work over it, but, coming up on a break is a good time to say, "Well, if I've lost connections, how can I reconnect?"
Hmm. Definitely.
Yeah,
Well,
so thank you for the suggestion. I thought it was really
no,
good.
thank you guys. I enjoyed talking to you guys tonight about it. I look forward to our next book chat in January.
Yeah, so we're going to be back in January, the last week. It's on the website, so it's lausanlearning.com/SEL, or you can go to SEL Book Club. We have two different places you can purchase the books there and register. Um, the book for January is like my favorite book, like nonfiction book. It's called Brave Not Perfect. And I think kind of like this is a great book to end the year and kind of like evaluate and reflect. This is a great book to kind of set your goals high for like how to act in the new year, how to act towards yourself and in society and towards others. That perfectionism, especially around the first of the year, is not perfectionism causes disconnection in a lot of ways. So I'm really excited about reading that one too after the holidays. So
Me too. Well, you guys have a good night. Good seeing everybody. Or good
yeah.
morning, whenever you're viewing this.
Right. We don't discriminate on time zones. So
Not at all.
it got dark at like 3 here, I'm pretty sure today. So it's been night for hours. So thank you everyone for watching this. Again, these happen every month during the school year. Our website is lausanlearning.com. You can also always reach me, Greg, or Amy on our website. We are all Lausanne Learning mentors. We would be happy to discuss the book further or discuss any ways we can help you and your school in this very weird, very trying time. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, Greg. Thank you, Amy, for the discussion. And I appreciate your time.